Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our sixth Cuba Hangout. On Fridays at 3:05, we've been exploring relevant and popular Cuba topics through conversations with a variety of fantastic speakers and members of our community. Cuba Hangout. On Fridays at 3:05. Probably a little reverb there. Our goal is to add a meaningful content to a complicated and often misrepresented topic, Cuba and U.S. relations. This ongoing series is brought to you by Cuba One Foundation and Cuba Educational Travel. My name is Daniel Jimenez, and I'm the founder and CEO of Cuba One Foundation. I'm a Cuban American. My father was a Pedro Pan, and I'm a big fan of pastelitos. Shout out to Tammy's Bakery in Kendall and Pastelito Papi. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Michael Bustamante, assistant professor of Latin American history at Florida International University. Michael specializes in modern Cuba, Cuban America, and the Caribbean. He's published 36 pieces on Cuba, including an academic essay on Beyonce and Jay-Z's 2013 visit. He has 3 degrees from Yale University and is the co-editor of the book, The Revolution from Within, Cuba 1959 to 1980, published this year with Duke University Press, and teaches the course on Cuban history at FIU, Cuba since 1959. He's here to talk with us about the impact of Tuesday's speech by John Bolton on updates to US-Cuba policy. So to kick us off, Michael, what was announced on Tuesday?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation to be here as a fan of the Cuba One Foundation. So there were 3 major announcements on Tuesday. I guess I would say the first concerned the implementation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act from 1996. Without getting into all the details, because it's a long and thorny subject, Title III, in essence, is a provision of that law from 1996 that allows U.S. citizens, people who were U.S. citizens at the time or who became U.S. citizens subsequently, to sue in U.S. courts anyone, a Cuban entity or a foreign entity, deemed to be trafficking, is the word the law uses, in property that was confiscated, i.e. nationalized, in the early years of the Cuban Revolution. Republican and Democratic administrations alike since 1996 had waived the implementation of this provision of the law. There's a presidential waiver authority written into it. And the Trump administration has now done something that no other administration has done, which is to say that the Title III is going to come fully into force. So that's piece number 1. And I think that was maybe the piece that we were most expecting. The 2 others were more of a surprise in a way. The first is that there are going to be, or I should say the US government is once again going to impose financial limits on the amount of money that people in the United States, Cuban Americans principally, can send to their family and friends on the island. So it's now going down to a limit of $1,000 a quarter, so $4,000 a year. And the previous, the last time that there were limits on remittances, you'd have to go back before 2009. It was a policy of the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration. One of the first things they did actually on Cuba policy was lift any limits in terms of the remittances that people could send to the island. And then the third thing is, I think probably what is of most concern to some of your organization's members, and I think to many Americans in general, is that there's been a vague announcement that there's new restrictions coming on non-family travel to the island. So on the one hand, they've made clear that the ability of Cuban Americans to travel to the island to see their family is not going to be touched. Sounds like you're still going to be able to go as often as you want. But for everybody else, there's just a big question mark. And so there's been some conflicting reporting, it seems to me. One of the first reports suggested that all other travel of any kind, academic travel, people-to-people travel, educational travel, you name it, was going to be cut off if it wasn't Cuban family travel. Mm-hmm. My sense is that John Bolton's remarks leave a little bit of wiggle room. There's talk of new restrictions on non-family travel, but what that means is really unclear at this point. And the people I've been talking to, I've heard a gamut. I've heard people say that, perhaps the restrictions won't be that bad, but perhaps they will. So those are the 3 kind of broad buckets of things that were announced on Tuesday.
All right, thanks so much for going through that. How are these three different changes to our policy going to affect this burgeoning entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs on the island?
I think they potentially have really damaging effects. I mean, so let's start with the remittances piece. Remittances are not, I think, increasingly over the last year or the last 10 years, were not only a means by which Cubans in the diaspora, and not just in the United States, but around the world, could support their families with, for subsistence reasons. It was also a channel through which, capital formation was starting to happen. Remittances were a vehicle for startup capital that doesn't otherwise exist on the island, in great abundance. And so there's a number of businesses, again, some remittances are still going to be able to get through, but there's a number of small businesses and entrepreneurs, I would say probably most of them, that depend on linkages outside of the island. And remittances, this is sort of an open question for me because, cash remittances are one thing, but the other part of remittance traffic is stuff, right? I mean, the wholesale market for a lot of Cuban small businesses at this point is in the United States, not only, but also in other places in the Caribbean. So are you going to now also be limited in the amount of stuff you can bring to the island from the US side? How do they calculate that? I think implementing this kind of a restriction is going to be very tricky. And we also know that a lot of this money flows in cash, but it is going to have, I think, it's going to be a cold shower for the private sector. I've also been thinking too about the remittances angle from the point of view of some of the payment systems that exist to support private businesses. And I'm less on firm ground here, so don't take me for it. But I was thinking about the case of Airbnb, for example. And my sense is that the way that people who rent through Airbnb in Havana, for example, get paid, at least at the start, was, the remittance channel was the one that was used to process a lot of those payments. And then the money would come in and Airbnb had runners. I think they've moved on to a more complex or more sort of advanced system, perhaps. But nonetheless, this vehicle, remittances, is also a vehicle for payment, right, for the private sector. And so how that affects things like Airbnb. I mean, are Cubans who rent out rooms in their homes going to get off that platform because they're cut off from being able to get paid as efficiently from the US? So that's another one. In terms of non-family travel, again, we have to wait to see for what the actual rules say, but let's take the scenario that things like people-to-people travel, or even the travel that's called support for the Cuban people, are suddenly no longer possible or more restricted. That means that average Americans who wanted to go to Cuba to support the private sector and tended to are not going to be able to. And so it is not the case that Cuban small businesses depend only on American visitors. There's visitors in Havana from all over the world. But it is safe to say that the market for the small businesses really boomed in the wake of the normalization efforts that began in 2014. And so a loss of a huge chunk of a market is definitely going to have effect on the private sector. And so, average people are going to feel it in their pocket. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of the private sector, I wonder about the implications of Title III in Helms-Burton for this. So Title III has written into it a kind of exceptions that you can't sort of sue in a U.S. court, to get your house back if your house is basically being used as residential property, right? But what about a house that, again, is being used to rent a room on Airbnb? Is that a commercial use of the property? Does that then fall under the definition of trafficking? I don't know. How do you sue an individual Cuban homeowner? I don't think you can in a practical sense, unless that homeowner has assets in the United States. But could you sue Airbnb as the intermediary here? I really don't know. Title III's implementation opens up a Pandora's box. And so the implications that that's going to have on Cuba's private sector in particular, to say nothing of the non-private sector, the public sector, I think we're really just going to have to wait and see how it plays out.
Gosh, it's going to be pretty crazy.
Yeah.
How is Cuba going to respond to this?
I think they're going to respond much in the way that they already have. I mean, if by Cuba you mean the Cuban government, and I'll take that first, they're obviously opposed to these measures. They feel that, and they've said this, that this does little to help Cuba, that it hurts the Cuban economy, is going to hurt the Cuban people. And there's also been a quite staunch sort of nationalistic tone, because the objectives with these policy measures are not go beyond what's on the page, as it were, right? This is about a broader strategy of resource denial to the government, no matter the collateral damage to people who get caught up in the middle of it. And so no surprise that the Cuban government does not take kindly to that kind of a strategy, and they've said as much. In terms of how Cuba's going to react, I haven't been there in the last 3 days, but from what I've seen on social media, I'd be hard pressed to find anybody who's excited, an average person who thinks this is a good thing. And I've seen some very thoughtful posts, including from people who are critical of the Cuban government for all sorts of reasons, and who don't see how a strategy of resource denial that hurts average people along the way, achieves anything. This, I think just as Cubans in general were very positive in outlook on the things that the Obama administration did, albeit while sometimes I think putting almost too much hope in that, I think the Trump administration and those who are backing this policy are setting themselves up to be seen as antagonists of everyday people's interests and livelihoods.
We've gotten a bunch of questions from our community, people that are traveling to Cuba, Cuban Americans, just wondering what the travel things are going to mean. I wanted to read one as sort of the next question that we got a couple days ago. I'm reaching out because I'm hoping to get a little bit of guidance. I'm engaged to a citizen of Cuba. We were originally planning to marry in Cuba this July, and I have already obtained all the documents necessary for marriage in the country. But I'm concerned with the announcement that was made regarding travel that we may need to marry sooner rather than later. In your opinion, do you think that I should travel to Cuba to marry right away, or is there nothing to worry about? Any perspective or direction would be greatly appreciated.
Well, first, congrats on your engagement. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give advice that is necessarily perfectly trustworthy in this regard. But I guess I would say, and I'm making the presumption that the writer is Cuban American, him or herself. If that's the case, and you have other family on the island, it seems to me that you're in all likelihood still going to be able to go when you want to go. It's worth noting that with travel rules, nothing has been implemented yet. The new travel rules have not been announced per se. They've announced a broad sense of what they're going to do, but the rules themselves are not specific. And so the current rules apply until the Treasury Department comes out with new rules. And so, and we don't know how long it's going to take either. When the Trump administration made its first US policy change in 2017, it took like 4 or 5 months for the actual rollout of regulations to follow to implement those policy changes. I don't think it's going to take that long this time, but how long it's going to take, I'm not sure. And so you might want to factor that into your travel plans. But I think even if there are new rules that really restrict, non-family travel, if you have a claim to family travel, and whether someone who you're engaged to rather than having yet been married to counts, I would hope it would. I would think that you would be okay. But again, I can't be sure.
Great. Well, so talk to a lawyer probably is the short answer to that. But you might be okay. And I'm sure that is going through a lot of people's head that are planning to do Cuba travel in the next few months. That's just one sort of really emotional example that we got. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about family visits. It seems like to be the most popular reason people travel to Cuba. I've heard over 500,000 people in 2018 under this license from the Treasury. And John Bolton specifically said that there wouldn't be any changes to family visits. Mm-hmm. What is a family visit?
I mean, currently, as I understand it, the purview of what counts as a family visit is pretty broadly defined. At one point going back, family visits were, who counted as family that you could visit was actually sort of described, like the degrees of separation were qualified. So, if you want to see your third cousin, it wouldn't count. It had to be sort of more immediate family. My recollection is that any purview of what counts as family has really been stripped away. I mean, check the the OFAC regulations themselves, which are available on the Treasury Department's website, to be sure. But that's my recollection, at least, that there's no current sort of limit on what counts as family. And this is a case too of the distance, I think, between the letter of the regulations or the law and capacity for enforcement. I mean, at a certain point, what counts as family is one's word against the word of the U.S. government. If you claim you're going to see your grandmother or your aunt or what have you, I mean, I haven't heard of a single case recently of anyone being asked to prove their family tie. So presuming that what John Bolton said is correct, and they're doing nothing to family travel, right? Not putting any boundaries around what counts as that, and keeping a general license for that, which means you can just go by checking a box effectively. I don't see that changing at all. I mean, what changes on the family travel front are the new remittance restrictions in theory, because family travel is also a way in which people brought cash to support their families. Again, how you enforce a remittance restriction if it's people bringing money in cash, I have no idea. But I don't see family travel as changing. I think that's a good thing. But I would highlight the inconsistency of, I think, political leaders recognizing that messing with people's ability to see their mom and their dad whenever they want is not a political winner for them, but at the same time denying the same right to travel to anyone else. There's a fundamental inconsistency there that sets up a kind of disparity that some people's travel is better than others. And personally, I just don't buy that. But again, I don't think family travel is going to change, and the purviews of it are really quite open.
Great. Let's do a couple questions from just our community. This first one's from Gina Bailey on Facebook. She asks, is it unconstitutional to restrict my travel as an American?
I mean, I think there's a long history of litigation in this regard. And you're putting me a little bit on the spot, because some of this was litigated, I believe, going back to the 1960s. And I believe, I mean, there's a case, I think, in the 60s of students who go, not Cuban Americans, but American students who go to Cuba and are brought to court for violating the travel ban when it was first imposed. And I believe the court found that, in fact, the U.S. government did have a right to restrict your travel. That's not to say that you can't sort of make a new constitutional argument. But again, I'm not a lawyer, but my recollection of the history is that this issue actually has been litigated. I would tend to, I don't think it should be. It seems quite contradictory that to quote unquote promote freedom elsewhere, we limit U.S. citizens' freedom. But I believe the government does have legal authority to do that. But if you're a lawyer and you want to take that case to court, I invite you to do it.
Great. This next one's from Melissa Mansfield on Instagram. She asks, is there anything we can do politically to have an influence on this?
I wish I was more optimistic. I mean, I think certainly speaking out, if you are in disagreement with these changes, always helps. Write your congressman, write your legislators if you disagree. But I have to be honest. I think this train is kind of sailing. I'm mixing metaphors there, but the train, not that has left the station entirely, but the current team in the White House that is really the engineers of this, I think they're hell-bent on implementing these changes. And I don't know as if much of anything is going to stop it. I do think there's an opportunity for the travel industry, other stakeholders, to try to lobby and influence the writing of these regulations. I mean, again, it's to be defined what the limitations on non-family travel are going to be, for example. So I don't know whether to what extent the airline industry, for example, is also trying to speak out. But do the typical things, make your voice heard. But this is a difficult moment for those who believe in the value of rapprochement and between the U.S. and Cuba, because this is also transpiring in a broader regional context where the Venezuela question enters, and we can debate that. But this is a strategy that's being applied very full in sort of a full-throated way, right? In fact, I think those who there were those who hoped the Trump administration would do this kind of thing much sooner. And then when they did it in 2017, they were quite upset and they made their voices heard. And there's been a number of key appointments in the White House since then that are people not new to the Cuba issue and have a very single-minded view that resource denial is the strategy for making the proverbial domino fall, even if we have 60 years of evidence to the contrary.
Final question, Michael. Is there a divide in the Cuban American community? And if so, how can we move forward as a community?
I mean, there's absolutely a divide. My colleagues at FIU have been running a poll of Cuban American public attitudes and opinions on matters of U.S.-Cuba relations for 20 years or so. And that poll has showed a few things. It showed that there has been a steady transition in Cuban American attitudes with regard to things like the embargo and travel rights and things like that. But it also shows that there's still a divide. The divide is not easy to sort of, I think people talk sometimes in too simplistic terms that it's old people versus young people, or recent arrivals versus those who came to the United States in the 1960s. And yeah, there are trends in those along those lines, but this is a very mixed bag, and so you can find people of all kinds of cohorts in the Cuban American community that support different pieces of this, or different visions of U.S. policy toward the island. What I would say though is that it is still abundantly clear that the majority of people support the rights of not only Cuban Americans to travel to the island, but the rights of Americans to travel to the island. And I think particularly for people, I think one of the big divides that I see is between people who have family on the island and people who really don't anymore, or are not really in touch. I think it's easier when you're not in touch with everyday people to say, yes, a strategy of resource denial, make the economy scream, right? Apply the pressure cooker effect so that people rise up on the streets. I think ethically, I have a really hard time ethically with that position, because it's, I think, easy to adopt that position from outside. And you're asking people, when it comes down to it, sometimes to do something that you didn't do, right? Not always the case, but sometimes. And so, there's been some really moving posts that I've seen along these lines, talking about the collateral damage to everyday people. And so I think, that's a message that I think is really important just to stress. That this hurts everyday people, and it is likely to hurt everyday people more than the government, I would say. And so, one thing I've just been thinking about is, if your idea of a strategy to make people's lives better is you have to make their lives worse first, I think ethically and morally that's complicated, to say the least. And so I would hope that there's opportunity for a conversation around that point, perhaps.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for joining us today. We don't have another one of these scheduled right now, but we are supposed to be talking with Sima Funk before he finishes up his U.S. tour on May 5th in Miami. I hope everyone will be able to join us. We'll be there, and we're going to have a pretty cool entrepreneurship event that's happening right beforehand. Stay tuned for the upcoming episodes, and thank you for watching. Bye all.